Abandoned by his billionaire family, he faced the judge alone until his wife walked into the courtroom. Welcome back, my wonderful family. I'm Mr. Peter. Before we begin, I have one small request. Nearly 98% of viewers watch without liking or subscribing. If you enjoy my stories, please like, comment, and subscribe. My goal is to reach 10,000 subscribers this month, and your support means everything. This is the only official Mr. Peter Stories World channel. If you see my stories reposted elsewhere, please report them. Now, let's begin today's story. The tow tank lab at Kaufman Hall smelled like chlorinated water and burnt coffee, and at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in October, it belonged to exactly 2 people. Bettina Loach stood at the drafting table with her sleeves pushed to her elbows, staring at a hull stress calculation that refused to balance no matter how many times she reworked it. She had redone the midship section 3 times. Each time, the numbers came back wrong in a way that felt personal. "Your buoyancy curve is off," a voice said behind her. She did not turn around right away. She recognized the voice from 2 classes and 1 group project she had spent most of complaining about under her breath. Roscoe Brannigan had a habit of appearing in rooms like he owned them, which, she had since learned from a classmate's offhand comment, he essentially did, in the sense that his family's company owned half the container cranes visible from the engineering building's east windows. "My buoyancy curve is fine," she said. "It is the displacement figure that is fighting me." He came around to look at her sketch anyway, close enough that she could smell the wet dog scent of a raincoat that had not fully dried since the afternoon storm. He studied the numbers for a long moment, longer than she expected from someone she had privately filed away, as more interested in being seen working than in actually working. "Your displacement is fine too," he said finally. "You have got the center of buoyancy shifted 2 centimeters aft of where it should sit. Everything downstream of that is going to look wrong because the one thing feeding it is wrong." She checked. He was right, and she hated that he was right, and she said so out loud, which made him laugh in a way that was not unkind. "I hate that I am right too most days," he said. "Ask anyone." That was how it started. Not with a dramatic collision of worlds, but with a 2-centimeter error in a hull calculation on a Tuesday night when neither of them had anywhere better to be. Over the following weeks, working late in the lab became something they did together without either of them formally deciding it. He brought coffee from the vending machine down the hall, the kind that tasted faintly of the machine itself. She brought a portable radio that only picked up 2 stations clearly, 1 gospel and 1 classic rock, and let him pick which one played depending on how the day had gone. Bettina had grown up in Berkeley, on the south side of the Elizabeth River, in a house where her father kept a fishing boat in the side yard that he was always halfway through repairing. She had learned to read a hull the way other kids learned to read a map, by running her hands along the waterline and asking why it curved the way it did. Naval architecture had never felt like an unusual choice to her, not until she got to Old Dominion and realized how few people in her program had grown up anywhere near a working harbor. Roscoe had grown up on the other side of that same river, in a house in Larchmont, with a view of the water and none of the boats in the yard needing repair because someone else was paid to do that. His family's company, Brannigan Maritime Group, ran cargo operations out of Norfolk International Terminals and had for 3 generations since his grandfather Osric Brannigan built it out of a single leased dock warehouse in the years after the war. Roscoe had chosen naval architecture over the business degree his father assumed he would take, and he had not yet told his father that the choice was permanent rather than a phase to be waited out. Neither of them talked much at first about where they came from. It was easier, in the tow tank lab at midnight, to talk about waterplane coefficients and midship sections, about the stubborn arithmetic of keeping a ship upright in rough water. The rest came later in pieces, over meals at a diner on Colley Avenue that stayed open past midnight for exactly the kind of students who kept the lab lights on too long. "My father thinks I'm doing this to embarrass him," Roscoe told her one night, over a plate of fries neither of them had touched. "He thinks a Brannigan belongs in an office, not bent over a drafting table arguing about hull coefficients with people who will never own a company." "Is that what you think you are doing?" Bettina asked. "Embarrassing him?" "No," he said. "I think I am doing the thing I actually want to do, and it happens to embarrass him as a side effect, which I have decided I can live with." He told her, that same night, about his Uncle Preston, his father's younger brother, who had married a woman from a shipyard family in Portsmouth decades earlier, a woman with calloused hands and no interest in the company's board meetings, and who had been quietly written out of family gatherings within 2 years of the wedding. Not because of who she was exactly, Roscoe explained, but because his father and grandfather had decided, without ever saying it plainly, that a Brannigan marrying outside a certain circle was a kind of leak in the hull, a place where the family's carefully maintained structure could start letting in water. "I do not think this is only about who a person is," Roscoe said. "I think it is about whether they can be controlled. I think that has always mattered more to my father than anything else." Bettina filed that away without responding to it directly, the way she filed away a piece of information she suspected she would need later, though she could not yet say exactly how. She liked his answer about embarrassment more than she expected to. She had grown up watching her own mother work double shifts at Centara Norfolk General so that Bettina's older brother could finish an associate's degree without debt, and she had a low tolerance for people who treated hard-won opportunity as an inconvenience. Roscoe did not do that. Whatever else was true about him, he showed up to the lab, did the work, and did not perform gratitude for having options other people did not have. He simply used them. By spring, they were no longer pretending the late nights were only about the coursework. They walked from Kaufman Hall down to the Elizabeth River most evenings after the lab closed, past the container cranes lit up against the dark like something out of a science fiction film, and talked about which of the ships docked at the terminals they could identify by hull design alone. Bettina could name a vessel's builder from 400 yards away more often than not. Roscoe found that more attractive than he was fully prepared to admit. Their first real date, if either of them had bothered to call it that at the time, was not a date at all in any conventional sense. It was an afternoon at Dumas on Monticello Avenue, eating ice cream out of cones the shop still rolled by hand the way it had for 100 years, arguing about whether a particular hull form they had studied that week was elegant or simply overbuilt. Bettina thought it was overbuilt. Roscoe thought elegance and overbuilding were not always opposites. They did not resolve the argument. They kept having versions of it for years. It was late in their senior year, on an evening in early April, that Roscoe brought her to his parents' house in Larchmont for the first time. He had put it off longer than either of them wanted to admit, and Bettina had noticed the delay without saying much about it, because she understood delay when she saw it. The house sat close to the water, with a lawn kept trim by a service and a dock where no boat was currently tied. Holt Brannigan met them at the door in a cardigan that looked more expensive than it had any right to, and shook Bettina's hand with a grip that was firm and brief, and told her nothing at all about what he actually thought. "Bettina," he said, testing the name like he was pricing it. "Roscoe tells us you are studying naval architecture as well." "I am," she said. "Same program as Roscoe. We met in the tow tank lab." "How practical," Holt said, and something in the way he said it made the word sound less like a compliment than a diagnosis. Dinner was long and quiet in the way dinners are quiet when everyone at the table is being careful. Roscoe's mother, Adelia, asked Bettina precise, pleasant questions about her family, about Berkeley, about her father's fishing boat, and nodded at each answer with an expression that gave away nothing except that she was cataloguing. Holt talked mostly about the terminal expansion Brannigan Maritime was pursuing that quarter, about tonnage figures and berth capacity, and included Bettina in the conversation only when politeness strictly required it. Roscoe drove her home afterward along Hampton Boulevard, both of them quiet for the first several minutes. "That went fine," he said finally, in the tone of a man trying to convince himself. "It went the way it went," Bettina said. She was looking out the window at the water on their left, dark and unbothered, the same river that ran past both their childhood houses on opposite banks. "Your mother was polite. Your father was measuring me for something. I could not tell you what yet." "He measures everyone," Roscoe said. "It does not mean anything." She did not answer that directly. She had grown up around people who said things did not mean anything right up until the moment those things meant everything, and she had learned a long time ago not to argue the point in the middle of the argument. She would watch instead, and wait, and see what the measuring turned out to be for. Neither of them said much else the rest of the drive. The car crossed into Berkeley, past the small brick house with the empty side yard, where a fishing boat used to sit before her father finally sold it, and Roscoe walked her to the door the way he always did, and kissed her good night the way he always did, and neither of them yet knew how long the ride home that night would end up mattering. Chapter 2. What the wedding cost. The engagement lasted less than a year, and in that time, Bettina watched Holt Brannigan's politeness curdle into something closer to strategy. It began with invitations that arrived late, or not at all. A summer gathering at the Larchmont house that Roscoe learned about second-hand, through a cousin, after it had already happened. A round of golf at a club Holt belonged to, extended to Roscoe alone, with no mention of Bettina at all, as though the invitation itself had simply forgotten she existed. Adelia handled the exclusions with more grace than her husband, softening each one with a phone call, explaining that the guest list had simply gotten complicated, that these things happened, that surely Bettina understood. Bettina understood perfectly well. She said as much to Roscoe one evening in her apartment on Colonial Avenue, the ring on her hand still new enough that she noticed its weight every time she moved her hand. "They are not confused about the guest list," she said. "They are deciding, one event at a time, how much of their life I get to be part of. You told me about your Uncle Preston. This is the same pattern, is it not? Slow, polite, deniable." "My father is old-fashioned," Roscoe said. "It is not the same as him being against this." "Roscoe." She said his name the way a teacher says a name before correcting an answer on the board. "I have watched your father look at me twice now, like he was pricing a piece of furniture he was not sure fit the house. That is not old-fashioned. That is a decision he has not finished making yet, and I would rather know what it is before it gets finished." He did not have a good answer for that, because he suspected she was right and did not want to say so out loud. He had spent his whole life reading his father's silences, and knew this particular one well. It was the silence Holt kept before a decision that had already been made, the quiet that came before the announcement rather than before the thinking. Holt Brannigan, for his part, did not think of himself as a man doing anything unusual. He had learned the shape of his own convictions from his father, Osric, who had built Brannigan Maritime out of a single leased warehouse on the Norfolk waterfront, and had never once, in 40 years of running it, let sentiment interfere with a decision that affected the company's stability. Osric had disowned his own younger brother in the 1960s over a business dispute that had nothing to do with love or marriage at all, and had told a much younger Holt more than once that a family that could not control its own edges would eventually lose its center. Holt had absorbed that lesson the way a child absorbs weather, without ever examining whether it was true, only whether it worked. It had, so far. The company had grown steadily for 3 generations, and Holt credited a good deal of that growth to the family's discipline about who got let inside the circle and who did not. He would not have called what he felt about Bettina prejudice, and in his own accounting of himself, he was telling something close to the truth, though not the whole of it. What he felt, more precisely, was the same anxious calculation he had applied to his brother Preston's wife decades earlier, and to two of Roscoe's cousin's spouses before that, a calculation that treated any partner without money, without the right last name, without a family the Brannigans already did business with, as an unknown variable in a structure that had survived this long specifically by minimizing unknown variables. That the unknown variable in this case also happened to be a black woman from Berkeley was not, in Holt's private reasoning, the point. It made the calculation easier to justify to himself, gave the old instinct a vocabulary that felt less like prejudice and more like caution, but the instinct itself predated Bettina by decades and would have found some version of her, regardless of what she looked like or where she came from. That distinction meant nothing to the people standing on the outside of it, and Holt never once considered explaining it to anyone, least of all to Bettina, because explaining it would have required admitting, even to himself, how much of his life had been organized around a fear he had never once questioned. The announcement, when it came, arrived over the phone on a Sunday afternoon in late winter, 3 weeks before the wedding. "Your mother tells me you have booked a chapel in Ghent," Holt said, with no greeting first. "Christ and St. Luke's. Small, modest guest list." "That is correct," Roscoe said. "We had assumed, given the family's standing, that you would want something larger. The Chrysler Museum has a garden that hosts events of that kind. I could make a call." "We do not want something larger," Roscoe said. "We want the chapel." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that in Holt Brannigan's conversations usually preceded the actual point. "I want to be clear about something," Holt said finally, "so there is no confusion later. If you go through with this, your position at Brannigan Maritime remains exactly what it is today. Your salary continues. Nothing changes on that front, as long as this stays a phase you are working through. I am not threatening you, Roscoe. I am simply telling you what remains true, and what I cannot promise will remain true if the phase becomes permanent." Roscoe stood very still in his kitchen, phone against his ear, and felt something in his chest go cold and clear at the same time. "It is not a phase," he said. "Then we will see," Holt said, and the call ended without either of them saying goodbye, which Roscoe understood, even as it happened to be its own kind of answer. He told Bettina about the call that night, sitting across from her at her small kitchen table, turning a glass of water in slow circles without drinking from it. "He called it a phase," Roscoe said. "Said my salary was safe as long as it stayed a phase." Bettina was quiet for a long moment. She had expected something like this, had braced for it in the vague way people brace for weather they cannot yet see, but hearing it confirmed still landed harder than she expected. "And what did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him it was not a phase." He looked up at her. "I meant it. I need you to know I meant it, whatever it ends up costing." "I believe you," she said, and she did, mostly. But she also understood something about Roscoe that she suspected he did not fully understand about himself yet, which was that meaning, a thing in the moment, and holding on to that meaning under real pressure over real years, were two different kinds of courage, and only one of them had actually been tested so far. The wedding took place on a clear Saturday morning in April at Christ and St. Luke's, a stone chapel on Stockley Gardens, with stained glass windows that threw colour across the pews whenever the sun found the right angle. The guest list numbered 40 people. Bettina's mother sat in the front row in a blue dress she had saved for a year to buy, next to Bettina's brother and 2 aunts who had driven up from Suffolk that morning. Roscoe's side of the chapel held a scattering of cousins, a few college friends, and 2 empty seats in the front row that everyone in the room understood were meant for Holt and Adelia Brannigan, and that nobody mentioned out loud. Bettina walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Her father, who had sold the fishing boat 2 years earlier and never fully forgiven himself for needing to, and if she felt the absence of the Brannigans as a hollow space at the front of the room, she did not let it show on her face. She had decided weeks earlier that she would not spend her wedding day performing grief over people who had not bothered to show up for it. The reception afterward was held in the fellowship hall behind the chapel, folding tables draped in white cloth, a caterer Bettina's mother had found through a friend at the hospital, and a small band that played mostly standards. Roscoe danced with Bettina's mother at one point, clumsily, both of them laughing at his footwork, and for an hour or two the day felt like exactly what it was supposed to be, uncomplicated and full. It was near the end of the reception, as the band packed up and the last guests said their goodbyes, that Roscoe's phone rang. He stepped outside onto the chapel steps to take it, and Bettina watched him through the fellowship hall window, his shoulders going rigid the way they did whenever his father was on the other end of a call. He came back inside a few minutes later, jacket still buttoned, face carefully arranged into something neutral. "That was him," he said. "Congratulations, apparently, though he did not use that word exactly." "What did he use?" Bettina asked. "He said he hoped I understood what I had chosen and that the door back to the family remained open, but that it would not stay open indefinitely." Roscoe rubbed the back of his neck. "He also asked whether I had signed anything today that could not be undone." Bettina felt something in her go very still. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I had signed exactly what I meant to sign and that I did not intend to undo any of it." He looked at her then, steady, the earlier uncertainty gone from his face in a way that surprised her a little. "And then I told him not to call again until he was ready to congratulate his son properly, and I hung up on him. First time in my life I have done that." Bettina reached for his hand across the folding table, and he let her take it, and neither of them said much else about the call for the rest of the evening. But she noticed, driving home that night with her wedding dress folded carefully in the back seat, that Roscoe kept glancing at his phone every few minutes, the way a person checks a wound to see whether it has actually stopped bleeding or only paused. It had not stopped, it had only paused. Neither of them knew yet how long the pause would last, or what it would cost to keep it from opening again. Chapter 3. The Slow Squeeze. The first sign came from a client Bettina had worked with for 2 years. She had been doing hull design contract work for a small marine engineering firm on Granby Street, the kind of firm that lived and died by referrals and repeat business. And one of her steadiest clients was a family-owned tug operator that had used her firm for every retrofit they had done since Bettina joined. In early autumn, the tug operator's owner called her supervisor directly, instead of going through Bettina as usual, to say they had decided to move their upcoming contract to a firm out of Portsmouth instead. He would not say why, her supervisor told her, apologetic and a little baffled. Just said it was time for a change. 9 years with us, and it was time for a change. Bettina did not think much of it at first. Clients left for all kinds of reasons, and marine engineering was a small, competitive world where relationships shifted for causes that rarely made it into a phone call. It was only when a second client, a smaller one, mentioned in passing that she had heard from someone on the foundation board that Bettina's firm was having quality problems that Bettina understood she was not watching an accident. The foundation in question was the Billionaire Family Foundation, a charitable organization Holt and Adelia had run for 2 decades, funding scholarships and small maritime trade apprenticeships around the Norfolk waterfront. Bettina had joined its volunteer board the year before her wedding, in what she now understood, looking back, had been either an act of good faith or a mistake, depending on how the rest of this went. She sat on the grants committee, reviewed applications twice a year, and had assumed, wrongly, that her presence on the board was a settled fact rather than a door someone else could quietly close. She raised the rumor with Adelia directly at a foundation dinner in October, choosing a moment when the two of them stood alone near the dessert table. "I have heard something strange," Bettina said, keeping her voice light, "that there are concerns being raised about my firm's work. I wondered if you had heard the same thing." Adelia's face did not change in any way Bettina could point to afterward and call proof of anything. "I have heard people talk," Adelia said. "You know how this community is. Everyone talks about everyone. I would not put much weight on it." "I am not putting weight on it," Bettina said. "I am asking you directly, because if something is being said that traces back to this foundation, I would rather hear it from you than piece it together second-hand." "Nothing is being said that traces back to this foundation," Adelia said, smooth and unhurried. She picked up a small dessert plate as she said it, selecting a single slice of pound cake with the unhurried precision of a woman for whom nothing in the room was actually about cake. "You are imagining connections that are not there, Bettina. Sometimes a client simply changes vendors." She paused and added almost gently, "Your father's boat business struggled toward the end too, did it not? Before he sold it. These things happen in small trades. It is rarely anyone's fault in particular." Bettina did not answer that. She recognized, even as the words landed, that Adelia had not mentioned her father's boat by accident, and that the gentleness in her voice was doing a great deal of work to disguise how precisely the comment had been aimed. Holt's cruelty, when it appeared, tended to arrive as a byproduct of some larger calculation, a man moving pieces on a board and only incidentally noticing who got stepped on. Adelia's cruelty was not a byproduct of anything. It was the point, delivered over pound cake in a voice pitched for no one else at the party to overhear, and Bettina understood, watching her walk away toward another cluster of guests, that she had just been shown exactly how personal this was for her. She did not believe Adelia's denial, though she had no way yet to prove otherwise, and she filed the conversation away the same careful way she filed away a hull calculation that did not balance, certain the error existed somewhere, even before she could point to it. Roscoe's version of the same slow squeeze arrived a few weeks later, in a conference room at Brannigan Maritime Group's headquarters near Norfolk International Terminals. He had been working toward a project lead position for over a year, overseeing the retrofit of 2 aging container cranes at the North Terminal, a role his direct supervisor had told him twice, informally, was effectively his to lose. When the position was finally posted internally, it went instead to a cousin of his, a man 3 years younger than Roscoe, with half his hands-on experience and considerably more comfort attending the golf outings Roscoe had stopped receiving invitations to. Roscoe went to his supervisor's office to ask why. "Above my pay grade," the supervisor said, not meeting his eyes for more than a second at a time. "That decision came down from your father's office directly. I was not given a reason, Roscoe. I would have fought for you if I thought fighting would have changed anything." Roscoe carried that conversation with him for days, turning it over the way he used to turn over a stubborn hull calculation, looking for the error that would make the numbers finally balance. He did not confront his father directly, not yet, because some part of him still wanted to believe there was an explanation that had nothing to do with Bettina, an explanation rooted in ordinary corporate politics rather than in punishment. That belief did not survive a dinner in November, one of the increasingly rare occasions Roscoe and Bettina were invited to the Larchmont house, an invitation that had arrived tellingly from Adelia rather than Holt. They ate in the same formal dining room where Bettina had first been measured and found wanting, and the conversation moved, as it usually did, toward business. Holt described the North Terminal retrofit at length, praising his nephew's handling of a scheduling conflict with more warmth than Roscoe had heard directed at him in months. "He has a good instinct for this work," Holt said. "Knows how to manage a room." "I would have managed that room the same way," Roscoe said. "I designed half the retrofit specifications he is currently implementing." Holt set down his fork with the deliberate care of a man choosing his next words carefully. "Design and management are different skills, Roscoe. Perhaps that is something you will grow into." Bettina watched Roscoe's jaw tighten and said nothing, because she understood this particular fight was not hers to have at this particular table. But later that night, driving home along the same stretch of Hampton Boulevard, where they had once driven home quiet and uncertain after their first dinner in this house, she finally said the thing she had been holding back for weeks. "They are not doing this by accident," she said. "The client who left my firm, the board members suddenly concerned about my work, your promotion going to your cousin. None of it is an accident, Roscoe. It is a pattern, and I think your parents are the ones drawing it." "You think my father is deliberately costing you clients," Roscoe said. "That seems like a stretch, even for him." "I do not think he is calling clients directly," Bettina said. "I think your mother mentions things at dinners and foundation events, the way she mentioned my father's fishing boat to my face, like it was a piece of trivia rather than his whole working life. And I think those mentions travel, and I think she knows exactly how far they travel and exactly how far they need to travel to do what she wants done. Your father moves money and titles around because that is the only language he has ever needed to learn. Your mother is doing something else. She is not managing a business problem, Roscoe. She is managing me, personally, and she is enjoying it." Roscoe did not argue with her, which she understood was its own kind of concession. He drove the rest of the way in silence, hands tight on the wheel, and when they reached their apartment, he sat for a long moment in the parked car before getting out. "I keep thinking there is a version of this where I go talk to him, and he stops," Roscoe said finally. "Man to man, father to son. I keep thinking that conversation exists somewhere, and I just have not found the right words for it yet." Bettina reached over and took his hand, the same gesture she had made across a folding table on their wedding night, though it felt heavier now than it had then. "Maybe it does not exist," she said gently. "Maybe the only thing that stops your father is deciding he has already lost, and I do not know yet what that would take." Neither of them knew, sitting in that car outside their apartment on a cold November night, how much further the squeeze would tighten before either question found its answer, or how expensive the finding would turn out to be. Chapter 4. The ledger Griffin Doyle had been the Brannigan family's attorney for longer than Roscoe had been alive, and in all that time, Roscoe had thought of him the way a person thinks of furniture that has always been in a room. Present, useful, unremarkable. It did not occur to him, even now, to wonder what Griffin actually did with the hours nobody watched, or what he owed the family that kept him so quietly, permanently employed. What Griffin owed them was specific and old, and he thought about it more often than anyone would have guessed from his careful, unbothered manner. 30 years earlier, his father's small practice on Granby Street had nearly folded during a lean stretch that coincided badly with a costly malpractice claim neither of them could afford to fight. Osric Brannigan, Holt's father, had quietly covered the settlement in exchange for nothing anyone could point to on paper. No contract, no favor spelled out, only an understanding that the Doyle family's practice would remain, from that point forward, an extension of the Brannigan family's interests whenever those interests required careful, discreet handling. Griffin had inherited both the practice and the understanding, and had spent 3 decades telling himself that gratitude and obligation were the same feeling wearing different clothes. He began that winter with the Brannigan Family Foundation's disbursement records, the routine paperwork tracking which scholarships and apprenticeship grants had been approved and paid out over the past 2 years. Bettina, as a grants committee volunteer, had signed off on dozens of these disbursements, her signature appearing on approval forms the way any board member's signature would. Griffin took copies of those forms and copies of the Foundation's bank statements and began, quietly, to alter them. The alterations were small at first, the kind of small that would survive a casual glance and only fall apart under close comparison against the originals. A disbursement approved for $8,000, routed through the standard scholarship account, became, in Griffin's altered version, a disbursement for $8,000, routed through a personal checking account that happened to share Bettina's name. A grant paid to a real apprenticeship program in Berkeley became on paper a grant paid to an entity that did not exist anywhere except in the file Griffin was assembling. He worked alone in his office on Granby Street, 3 blocks from the firm where Bettina still, for now, held her job, and he did not enjoy the work exactly, though enjoyment had never been the deciding factor in anything he did for the Brannigans. There was a night in late December, close to midnight, when he sat with the folder half finished and found himself thinking about his father, about the settlement, about the particular quiet way debts like that never actually closed, only compounded. He thought for a moment about simply telling Holt he could not do this one. He thought about it the way a man thinks about jumping from a bridge he has walked across 1,000 times, an idea examined briefly and then set back down exactly where he found it, because the alternative, closing 30 years of quiet obligation with a single refusal, felt less like freedom and more like detonation. He did not ask Holt Brannigan for explicit instructions on every alteration because he did not need to. Holt had made his wishes clear enough in a single conversation months earlier, a conversation that had never used the words fraud or forge or frame, and had not needed to. "I want this handled the way these things are always handled," Holt had said, quietly and permanently. Griffin understood permanently to mean a case strong enough to end things, not merely delay them, and built accordingly. The folder reached Holt's desk in late January, thick with photocopies and a summary memo written in Griffin's careful, lawyerly hand. Holt read it twice, sitting alone in his study with the door closed, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite doubt, a feeling closer to the sensation of watching a piece of machinery start up correctly after a long period of tinkering. He called Roscoe to the house the following Sunday, alone, without Adelia present, which Roscoe understood immediately to mean something serious was coming. They sat in Holt's study, the same room where the folder had spent the previous week, and Holt slid it across the desk without preamble. "I need you to look at this before it goes any further," Holt said. "I have concerns, Roscoe, serious ones, about Bettina's conduct on the foundation board." Roscoe opened the folder with the specific dread of a man who already suspects he will not like what he finds, and does not yet know how much he will not like it. He looked at the photocopied disbursement forms, at figures and account numbers that meant little to him on their own, and felt his father watching his face for a reaction the way Holt had once watched a room full of shareholders. "This says she routed foundation money into a personal account," Roscoe said slowly. "That is what the documents show," Holt said. "I did not want to believe it either. But the paperwork does not lie, Roscoe. Numbers do not have motives. They simply are what they are." Roscoe stared at the pages for a long moment, at a signature that looked like Bettina's signature, at figures that lined up in a way that felt solid and official and entirely wrong in some way he could not yet name. He thought about the tow tank lab, about a 2-centimeter error in a hull calculation that had once seemed impossible until he found exactly where it lived. He thought about how confident he had felt that night, certain the error existed somewhere even before he could point to it. "I want to talk to her about this," Roscoe said. "Before anything happens, I want to hear what she says." "Of course," Holt said, in a tone that suggested this was both expected and, in his estimation, unlikely to change anything. "Talk to her, but Roscoe, I would ask you to consider something while you do. Foundations like ours exist because people trust that the money goes where it says it goes. If something like this is true, and it goes unaddressed, it does not only damage Bettina, it damages every family who has ever received a scholarship through us, every apprentice whose training depended on funds actually reaching the program they were meant for." Roscoe left the house that evening, carrying the folder though he had not planned to. Holt had not asked for it back, and Roscoe had not thought to offer it, and later he would understand that small failure of instinct as the first true crack in his certainty, the first moment he treated the possibility of Bettina's guilt as something requiring active investigation rather than automatic dismissal. He did not show her the folder that night. He told himself he needed time to look at it properly first, to understand what it actually claimed before bringing it to her, though some quieter part of him understood the delay differently. He was, for the first time in their marriage, afraid of what her face might do when she saw it, afraid of a version of that moment where she looked guilty rather than confused. Bettina noticed the change in him without knowing its cause. He was quieter over the following week, distracted in a way that had nothing to do with the crane retrofit or the cousin who had taken his promotion. She asked him twice what was wrong, and both times he told her it was nothing, work stress, his father being his father, and both times she let the answer stand longer than she should have, because she had her own worries that week and did not have the energy to press. It was Roscoe himself who finally broke the silence, 10 days after the meeting in his father's study, sitting across from her at their kitchen table with the folder unopened between them. "My father showed me something," he said, "about the foundation, about you." Bettina's expression shifted from confusion to something colder as he explained, as he opened the folder and spread the photocopied pages across the table between them, as she looked down at a signature that resembled hers on documents she had never seen before in her life. "Roscoe," she said, and her voice had gone very quiet and very careful, the voice of a person choosing each word with precision because the moment demanded it. "I have never seen these forms. I approve grants at board meetings, on paper the Foundation's own staff prepares. I have never routed a single dollar anywhere except where the committee voted for it to go." "I want to believe that," Roscoe said, and the sentence came out smaller than he meant it to, smaller than the certainty he had promised her on their wedding day. Bettina heard the smallness in it, heard the space he had left for doubt where there should have been none, and something in her chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the folder on the table and everything to do with the man sitting across from her, hesitating, for the first time since she had known him, to simply believe her. Chapter 5. Cut off. The protective order arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a process server who caught Bettina in the parking lot of her office on Granby Street, before she had even made it inside for the day. She read it twice, standing beside her car, the January wind cutting through her coat, trying to make sense of language that described a person she did not recognize. The petition claimed she had made threatening statements toward Roscoe during an argument at their apartment the previous week, statements no one had actually spoken, describing a confrontation that had not happened in the form the document described. It was filed under Holt Brannigan's name as a concerned family member, supported by a sworn statement from Adelia describing second-hand fears for her son's safety, and it barred Bettina, effective immediately, from the apartment she had shared with her husband and from any direct contact with him while the matter proceeded. She called Roscoe from the parking lot, hands shaking hard enough that she had to try the number twice. "They filed a protective order," she said, before he could say anything at all. "Your parents, against me. It says I threatened you, Roscoe, and I did not threaten you. I have never once raised my hand or my voice at you in a way that even resembles what this document describes." There was a long silence on the line, longer than she wanted, and when Roscoe finally spoke, his voice sounded distant in a way she had never heard from him before. "I do not know anything about this," he said. "I need to call my father." "Roscoe." Her voice cracked on his name. "You believe me, do you not? Tell me you believe me." "I believe you," he said. But the pause before he said it lasted a half-second too long, and Bettina heard the half-second the way she had once heard a 2-centimeter error in a hull calculation, small and precise and impossible to unhear once found. The order held for the length of a Norfolk winter that felt to Bettina like it would never end. She moved into her mother's house in Berkeley, back into the small bedroom she had grown up in, and spent her days working from a laptop at the kitchen table, where her father used to spread out engine parts from the boat he no longer owned. She was not permitted to call Roscoe directly, not permitted to appear anywhere near the apartment, and she watched her marriage recede from her the way a shoreline recedes from a departing ship, gradually, and then it felt all at once. Roscoe, for his part, spent those same weeks inside a fog his father was careful to keep thick. Holt visited him twice that first week, bringing groceries Roscoe had not asked for and conversation that circled every time back to the same theme. "This is not the woman you thought you married," Holt said more than once. "I am sorry, son. I know this is not what you wanted to hear. But a man has to see clearly, eventually, and I would rather you see it now than after something worse happens." Roscoe did not fully believe him, not at first, but belief, he was learning, did not need to be complete to do damage. It only needed a foothold, a gap wide enough to let doubt in, and the folder full of forged disbursement forms had already opened that gap weeks earlier. The protective order widened it further because it arrived dressed in the language of the law, official and stamped and signed by a clerk, and Roscoe had spent his whole life trained to trust documents over instinct. It was Adelia who delivered the final piece on a grey afternoon in February, sitting across from Roscoe at the kitchen table of the Larchmont house with a folder of her own. She had chosen the kitchen table deliberately over the study, a detail Roscoe would not understand the weight of until much later. The kitchen being the room in that house reserved for conversations meant to feel warm, regardless of what they actually contained. "I did not want to be the one to tell you this," Adelia said, and her voice carried a softness Roscoe had rarely heard from her, a softness that felt, though he would not understand this until much later, entirely rehearsed, the way a person rehearses a difficult line until the difficulty itself sounds effortless. "But I think you deserve to know rather than hear it secondhand. Bettina's attorney contacted ours last week. She has signed preliminary divorce paperwork, Roscoe. I think she has decided to move on quietly before the foundation matter becomes public and complicates things further for her." She reached across and rested her hand briefly on his, a gesture of comfort she performed with the same unhurried precision she had once used to select a slice of pound cake. "I know how much you loved her. I want you to know I never once wished this on you." She slid a single page across the table, a signature at the bottom that looked to Roscoe's tired and doubting eyes, close enough to Bettina's actual signature to pass. It was not her signature. It had been produced by Griffin Doyle, in the same careful hand that had produced the disbursement forms months earlier, traced from an old grant approval form Bettina had signed years before, the letters copied with the patience of a man who had learned, over a long career, exactly how much forgery a grieving son would be willing to examine closely. Adelia had reviewed the page herself before bringing it to the table, had suggested, in fact, the small flourish on the final letter of the signature that made it look more convincingly tired, more convincingly like the hand of a woman signing away something she no longer had the strength to fight for. Holt built the case. Adelia built the moment, and she had built it to land exactly where it did. Roscoe did not examine it closely. He looked at it once, felt something in his chest cave in a slow and total way, and did not ask his mother a single follow-up question, because some part of him had already decided, weeks earlier, that he did not have the strength left to keep hoping against evidence that kept arriving in his father's careful, official handwriting. "Where is she?" he asked finally. "If she has decided to move on, where did she go?" "I do not know," Adelia said. "Her attorney did not say. I imagine she wanted a clean break, given everything else happening around her right now." Bettina, 3 miles away in her mother's kitchen in Berkeley, knew nothing of the signature Adelia had shown her son. She had not spoken to a divorce attorney. She had not signed anything except the grants approval forms Griffin Doyle's team had spent months quietly copying and recopying, and she had no way from where she sat to know that a version of her own hand had been used to end her marriage without her knowledge or her consent. What she did know, sitting at that table with her mother's hand resting on her shoulder, was that the silence from Roscoe's side of the protective order had gone total. No calls, no messages relayed through attorneys, nothing but the slow, grinding progress of a fraud case that seemed determined to move forward whether or not anyone involved in it had actually done anything wrong. "He is not calling because he cannot," her mother said gently one evening, watching Bettina stare at a phone that had not rung in days. "The order says he cannot contact you. That is all this is, baby. Paper keeping him quiet. It is not the same as him choosing to be quiet." "I know that," Bettina said, though she found, as the weeks stretched on without a single word finding its way to her through any channel at all, that knowing it and feeling it were not the same thing, and that the space between those two truths was exactly where Holt Brannigan and Griffin Doyle had built their case to live. She did not yet know how deep that case went, how many forged signatures and false accounts and careful conversations had gone into building the version of her that now existed in a court file downtown. She only knew that she was alone, cut off from her husband by a wall of paper neither of them had chosen, and that somewhere on the other side of that wall, Roscoe Brannigan was being told a story about her that had nothing to do with who she actually was. It would take a phone call to an old friend, a friend who understood numbers the way Bettina understood hull calculations, before either of them would learn how much of that story had been invented, page by careful page, by people who had decided, a long time ago, that the truth was less useful to them than the version they were willing to build. Chapter 6. Dorian. The call to Dorian Achebe happened almost by accident on a night in early March when Bettina had run out of other numbers to try. She had spent the previous 6 weeks calling every person she could think of who might understand what was happening to her, a legal aid line that could not take new cases until April, a former professor who offered sympathy but no practical help, a cousin who worked in insurance and knew nothing about forensic accounting but knew someone who did. It was that cousin, finally, who gave her Dorian's number, along with a warning that he was hard to reach and harder to convince. Dorian had gone to Old Dominion 2 years ahead of Bettina in the accounting program on the other side of campus from Kaufman Hall, and the two of them had crossed paths exactly once at a mutual friend's graduation party where they had spent most of an hour arguing about whether numbers could ever really tell the whole truth about a person. Dorian had argued yes. Bettina had argued that numbers told the truth about transactions, not people, and that the two were not the same thing, an argument she found herself thinking about again now, 6 years later, sitting at her mother's kitchen table with a phone against her ear. "I remember that conversation," Dorian said, once she had explained enough of the situation to make clear why she was calling. "You were right, for what it is worth. Numbers do not lie about people, but they also do not lie about themselves. If someone altered these documents, the alteration leaves a trace somewhere, even if the trace is small." "I do not have money to pay you properly for this," Bettina said. "I do not have much of anything right now." "I did not ask you for money," Dorian said. "Send me what you have, all of it. Let me look before either of us decides what this is worth." She emailed him everything that night. The photocopied disbursement forms Griffin Doyle's file had produced, the account numbers listed on each one, the date stamped across the top of every page. Dorian called her back 2 days later, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a person who has found something and is trying not to sound too certain before he has confirmed it fully. "The account number on these forms," he said. The one they claim you routed the money into. I ran it against the state corporation database and the county's UCC filing system, because personal accounts sometimes show up there if they are tied to any kind of lien or business registration. It came back attached to something. Attached to what? Bettina asked. A used vehicle loan, Dorian said, taken out under your name at a credit union in Chesapeake financing a car. The loan origination date is listed clearly on the filing. It is 2 weeks after the date on your earliest disbursement form. Bettina sat with that for a moment, doing the arithmetic slowly, the way she used to check a Hull calculation twice before trusting it. The account did not exist yet, she said, not when they say I used it. Correct, Dorian said. Whoever built this file worked backward from an account that was real, but they got the timeline wrong. Forgers usually do eventually. They are so focused on making the signature look right that they forget the world around the signature has its own timestamps, ones they do not control. It was the first solid thing Bettina had held onto in weeks, and she found herself gripping the phone tighter, as though the fact itself might slip away if she let go. Is that enough? She asked. Enough to prove I did not do this? It is a real discrepancy, Dorian said carefully. It is not proof of everything yet. It proves the specific account listed on this specific form could not have received funds on the date claimed, because the account did not exist. That is one loose thread. We need to see how far it unravels before either of us gets excited about it. Over the following weeks, that unraveling became the shape of Bettina's days. She and Dorian worked mostly by phone and email, since she could not easily leave her mother's house without the trip costing money she did not have, and Dorian fit the work in around a full-time job at an accounting firm downtown, staying late most nights to pull the foundation's actual filed tax records from the IRS database and compare them line by line against the version in Griffin Doyle's file. The Foundation's real Form 990 filings, the ones submitted annually to the federal government and available to anyone willing to search for them, told a different story than the disbursement forms Bettina had been shown. Grants that Griffin's file claimed had been rerouted appeared in the actual filed records exactly where Bettina remembered approving them, paid to real apprenticeship programs and scholarship recipients whose names Dorian was able to independently verify still existed, still operated, still received the funding the Foundation's public filing said they received. Someone built a second private version of these records, Dorian told her one evening, his voice carrying an edge of something close to anger on her behalf. A version that only exists in the file they showed your husband and presumably whatever attorney is handling the criminal side of this. It does not match what the Foundation actually filed with the federal government, which means whoever built it either forgot the real filings existed or assumed nobody would bother checking them against each other. Who would do this? Bettina asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer and did not want to say it out loud yet. That is not a question numbers can answer, Dorian said. Numbers can tell you what happened. They cannot tell you why or who benefits. For that, you need to think about who had access to both versions of these records and who had a reason to want the fake one believed over the real one. Bettina thought about Griffin Doyle's careful, lawyerly handwriting on the summary memo she had glimpsed once, months earlier, before she understood what it meant. She thought about Adelia's smooth denial at the Foundation dinner in October and about Holt's quiet, deliberate mention of protecting the Foundation's reputation. She did not say any of their names out loud to Dorian that night, not yet, because saying them felt like committing to a fight she was not certain she had the resources to win. I need this documented properly, she said instead, not just for me to understand. For a court to understand, if it comes to that. It is already coming to that, Dorian said. You have a criminal case moving forward, Bettina. We are not building this for our own satisfaction. We are building it because someone is going to have to stand in front of a judge and explain why the numbers do not match, and it should be you holding the explanation, not the other side holding the excuse. She thanked him and hung up and sat for a long time in her mother's kitchen looking at the printed pages Dorian had emailed her, The real filings and the fake ones laid side by side, a discrepancy sitting between them that felt, for the first time in months, like something she could actually hold onto and use. It would be weeks yet before that discrepancy reached a courtroom, and longer still before Roscoe would learn any of it existed. But for the first time since the protective order had arrived in that parking lot on Granby Street, Bettina Loach went to sleep that night with something other than dread waiting for her in the morning. Chapter 7. The Docket. The case was formally filed in early April, under the name Commonwealth versus Bettina Loach, and assigned by the ordinary rotation of the Circuit Court for the City of Norfolk to Judge Miriam Voss. Bettina did not know, when she first heard the assignment, what that name would come to mean. She learned some of it from her public defender, a tired, capable woman named Renata Stedman, who carried a caseload 3 times the size any single person should reasonably manage, and who explained, in the flat voice of someone delivering unwelcome but unsurprising news, that Judge Voss had a long professional relationship with the Brannigan family, one that predated the case by decades. "She has presided over Foundation-related matters before," Renata said, flipping through a thin folder in a courthouse hallway that smelled like floor wax and old paper. "Nothing improper on the record. But Norfolk's legal community is small, Bettina. Everyone knows everyone. I am telling you this so you understand the water we are swimming in, not because I think it means we cannot win." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the last week of April, and Renata had filed a motion 2 weeks earlier requesting a continuance, additional time to review the financial records the prosecution intended to introduce. Records that Dorian Achebe was still working through piece by piece, still cross-referencing against the Foundation's real federal filings. Judge Voss denied the motion on the morning of the hearing itself, before either side had finished making their case for it. "The court has reviewed the request," Voss said, barely glancing up from the bench. "Counsel has had adequate time. This matter will proceed as scheduled." Bettina sat at the defense table in a blazer she had borrowed from her mother, watching Renata's jaw tighten at the ruling, and felt the floor of the courtroom tilt slightly under her, the particular vertigo of watching a process that was supposed to be fair reveal, in one small procedural decision, that fairness might not be the point. The hearing itself was brief and procedural, the kind of hearing that exists mainly to determine whether a case proceeds to trial rather than to weigh its merits in full. The prosecutor, a young assistant Commonwealth's attorney named Foster Bramlett, who seemed genuinely unaware of the deeper currents running beneath the case he had been assigned, presented the disbursement forms from Griffin Doyle's file as though they were simply routine evidence, financial records like any other, and Judge Voss accepted them into the record without hesitation. Renata objected twice, once to the pace of the proceeding and once to the chain of custody on the disbursement forms themselves, arguing that the defense had not been given adequate opportunity to verify their authenticity against the Foundation's original records. Both objections were overruled quickly, with a brevity that felt, to Bettina, less like careful judicial reasoning and more like a door being closed before anyone could look too closely at what was behind it. "The court finds sufficient basis to proceed to trial," Voss said, near the end of the 20-minute hearing. "Trial date will be set for early June. Bail conditions remain as previously ordered." Bettina walked out of the courthouse that afternoon into a grey Norfolk sky that seemed to match exactly how she felt, hollowed out and rushed past, a person whose case had been handled with the efficiency of a conveyor belt rather than the care a life actually deserved. "That was fast," she said to Renata once they were outside on the courthouse steps. "Too fast. Is that normal?" "It is not abnormal," Renata said carefully. "Preliminary hearings move quickly by design. But the continuance denial, combined with how quickly she accepted those forms without giving us time to properly contest their authenticity, that is not nothing, Bettina. I want you to understand what we are working against here. This is not simply a case where the evidence happens to look bad. Someone with real resources built this file, and someone with real influence appears determined to move it through this courtroom faster than the ordinary pace would allow. "Can we do anything about the judge?" Bettina asked. "Ask for a different one." "We can file a motion to recuse, but we would need something concrete, some documented conflict of interest, not just a general sense that something feels wrong." Judges recuse themselves over specific relationships, specific financial ties, specific prior involvement in a matter. A vague sense of familiarity between families in a small legal community is not enough on its own, not without more. Bettina thought of Dorian, working late most nights in his office downtown, slowly building the specific documented thing Renata was describing. The account that did not exist yet on the date it was supposedly used, the real federal filings that contradicted the fake ones Griffin Doyle had assembled. She had not yet told Renata the full extent of what Dorian had found, mostly because she and Dorian were still confirming it themselves, still making certain every piece held before bringing it forward in a setting where a mistake could not be quietly corrected. "We are building something," Bettina said. "I have a friend, an accountant, who has found real discrepancies in the timeline on these forms. I did not want to bring it forward until we were certain it would hold up." Renata's expression shifted, something like cautious hope crossing her tired face for the first time that day. "Bring me everything you have as soon as you have it confirmed. A trial date in June gives us 6 weeks. That is not much time, but it is enough time if what your friend has found is as solid as you believe it is." Bettina nodded, and the two women parted on the courthouse steps. Renata heading back inside to file the next motion in a caseload that would not slow down for her. Bettina walking toward the bus stop on St. Paul's Boulevard because she did not own a car anymore, having sold hers 2 months earlier to cover legal fees Renata's public defender salary could not fully absorb. She thought, on the ride back to Berkeley, about Roscoe, about the silence that had now stretched across the length of an entire Virginia winter and was beginning to bleed into spring. She did not know, riding that bus past the shipyards and the container cranes lit orange against the evening sky, that 3 miles away, in an apartment he now occupied alone, Roscoe Brannigan had begun, almost against his own will, to notice small inconsistencies in the story his parents had been telling him for months. Inconsistencies he had not yet allowed himself to examine too closely, because examining them meant confronting what they might mean about the people who had raised him. Neither of them knew how close that examination was. It would come, when it finally came, not from a conversation or a confrontation, but from a newspaper brief, 3 column inches long, that Roscoe would nearly skip over entirely on an ordinary Tuesday morning, before something in the second paragraph made him stop, and read it again, and understand all at once exactly whose name he was looking at. Chapter 8. What he was told. The newspaper brief ran on a Tuesday in mid-May. Tucked into the local section of the paper, Roscoe had started reading again out of a habit he did not fully examine, 3 column inches under a headline that read simply, "Norfolk Woman Faces Foundation Fraud Charges." He almost turned the page. He had been turning pages quickly for months, avoiding anything that touched too closely on the shape of his own life, and the headline alone told him nothing that connected to Bettina in any way he registered on first glance. It was the second paragraph that stopped him, a single sentence identifying the defendant by name, a name he had said out loud every day for 2 years before the silence began, a name he still, even now, said sometimes in his sleep. Bettina Loach, 30, faces trial in June on charges related to alleged misappropriation of funds from a local charitable foundation. He read the sentence 3 times before it fully landed, and when it did, it landed the way a hull failure lands, not gradually but all at once, an entire structure giving way in the space of a single second. He had been told she signed divorce papers and disappeared. He had been told this by his mother, sitting at the same kitchen table where he now sat holding a newspaper with hands that had gone unsteady. He had not questioned it closely enough, had not asked the follow-up questions a less exhausted, less grief-flattened version of himself might have asked. Questions like, where did she go? And why has no one heard from her since? And why did her attorney never once contact mine directly to finalize anything? He sat with the paper for a long time that morning, the coffee in front of him going cold, and thought, unexpectedly, of his Uncle Preston, of the story he had told Bettina years earlier in a diner on Colley Avenue as though it was simply family history, a cautionary tale with no real bearing on his own life. He understood now, reading a newspaper brief with his wife's name in it, that he had told that story the way a person tells a story about weather in another country, interesting, distant, incapable of touching him. It had never occurred to him, not once in 2 years of marriage, that his own father might apply the same logic to his own wife, might treat her as precisely the kind of unknown variable Osric Brannigan had once decided Preston's wife represented. He had thought himself different. He had thought loving her enough would be sufficient protection against a pattern that predated both of them by decades. He understood now that love had never been the variable his father was solving for. He called his father's office that afternoon, and when Holt's assistant told him Holt was in a meeting and would call back later, Roscoe said, in a voice that surprised even himself with its flatness, that he would wait on the line. Holt came to the phone 11 minutes later, sounding faintly annoyed at the interruption. "Roscoe, I am in the middle of something. What is this about?" "I read something in the paper today," Roscoe said, "about Bettina, about a fraud case, set for trial next month." There was a pause on the line, brief but unmistakable, the pause of a man recalculating in real time. "I did not want you to have to think about that," Holt said finally, his voice smoothing into something careful and paternal. "It is an unfortunate matter, Roscoe, but not one that concerns you any longer, given everything that has already happened between the two of you." "You told me she signed divorce papers and disappeared," Roscoe said. "You did not tell me she was facing criminal charges. You did not tell me my own family's law firm appears to be involved in the case against her. Griffin built that folder, did he not? The one you showed me in January." "Griffin represents this family's interests," Holt said. "That is his job. It has nothing to do with the personal matter between you and Bettina." "It has everything to do with it," Roscoe said, and he heard his own voice rising for the first time in longer than he could remember, months of careful, exhausted quiet, finally cracking open. "You told me she left. You showed me a signature and told me she signed away our marriage and vanished. And the whole time, she was 3 miles away in her mother's house, unable to even call me because of a protective order your firm filed, fighting a case your firm's own attorney appears to have built against her, just like Preston's wife. You did this exact thing before, did you not? You and grandfather both. This is not new. This is just the family doing what the family has always done." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Roscoe understood, before his father said another word, that he had struck something true. "Your uncle's marriage cost this company 2 of its largest accounts before I ever intervened," Holt said, his voice going flat and hard in a register Roscoe had rarely heard, something closer to honesty than he had expected. His wife's family had business ties to a competitor. "It was not personal, Roscoe. It was never personal. It was arithmetic, the same arithmetic my father taught me, the same arithmetic I am trying badly, I will admit, to teach you. A family like ours does not survive 3 generations by leaving its structure open to anyone who happens to fall in love with one of its sons. I did what I believed was necessary to protect this family. You will understand that better one day when you have a family of your own to protect." "There was no competitor tied to Bettina," Roscoe said quietly. "There was no arithmetic here, except the one you invented to make yourself feel like a businessman instead of what you actually did, which was destroy an innocent woman's reputation and nearly her freedom because you could not stand the idea of a Brannigan marrying someone you had not personally approved." Holt did not answer that directly, and his silence this time carried none of the earlier honesty, only the practiced quiet of a man retreating back behind a door he had briefly, accidentally, left open. "I have said what I am willing to say on this call," Holt said finally. Roscoe hung up without responding further, because there was nothing left to say that would change anything, and because he understood, sitting alone in the apartment that had once belonged to both of them, that he had spent the last several months grieving a marriage that had never actually ended, doubting a wife who had never actually left him, believing a story built, page by careful page, by his own parents, out of the same fear that had cost him an uncle he barely remembered, and a cousin by marriage he had never been allowed to meet. He sat with that understanding for a long time, the cold coffee still in front of him, the newspaper still open to the same 3-column inches, and felt something in himself that he did not immediately recognize as shame, because he had not encountered it in this particular shape before. It was not the shame of having done something wrong himself, not exactly. It was the deeper, quieter shame of having let someone he loved stand alone in a courtroom shadow for months, because he had trusted the people who raised him more than he had trusted the woman who had never once given him a reason not to trust her. He thought about the tow tank lab, about a 2-centimeter error he had spotted in her hull calculation on the first night they ever spoke, an error that had seemed at the time like the kind of small, honest mistake anyone might make while working through something difficult. He thought about how easily he had trusted his own eye that night, how quickly he had believed the evidence in front of him without needing anyone to convince him of it. He had not extended Bettina that same trust when it mattered most. He had let a folder full of paper, produced by people with every reason to want him doubting her, do the work that his own judgment should have done instead. Roscoe did not know that evening exactly what he would do next, only that whatever it was would have to start with finding her, and that finding her would mean admitting out loud to her face exactly how badly he had failed the one promise he had made on their wedding day. He sat with that knowledge until the light outside the window went fully dark, and then he picked up his phone and began, for the first time in months, to actually look for his wife. Chapter 9. The routing numbers. Bettina did not answer when Roscoe called her cell phone that first night because she no longer recognized the number, having changed it weeks earlier after a series of calls from an unknown source she suspected, correctly, traced back to Griffin Doyle's office. She saw a voicemail notification the next morning from a number she also did not recognize, and nearly deleted it unheard before something made her press play instead. His voice, when it came through the speaker, sounded like it belonged to someone she had not spoken to in a very long time, though it had only been months. "Bettina, it is Roscoe. I know you have every reason not to want to hear from me, and I am not calling to ask you to forgive anything yet. I am calling because I read something yesterday I should have known months ago, and I need to see you, if you will let me, and I need to tell you what I finally understand." She sat with the voicemail for a long time before calling the number back, turning the decision over, the way she turned over a stubborn calculation, uncertain whether trusting him again was wisdom or simply exhaustion disguising itself as hope. She did not call back that day. She let it sit 2 full days, needing to know the impulse to answer was hers, and not simply the old habit of a woman who had spent 2 years making room for him without thinking twice about it. They met, finally, in a coffee shop on Colley Avenue, neutral ground neither of them had strong memories tied to, and Roscoe told her everything, the call to his father, the story of Preston's wife he had once told her as though it were harmless history, the admission Holt had finally made without quite meaning to make it, the shame that had kept him awake most of the previous night, turning over every small moment where he could have chosen to trust her instead of the folder his family had handed him. "I am not asking you to forgive me today," he said, hands wrapped around a coffee cup he had not touched. "I am asking you to let me help fix this, whatever that takes, for as long as that takes." Bettina studied him for a long moment, weighing the man in front of her against the silence that had swallowed the better part of a year. "There is a friend of mine, an accountant, Dorian Achebe. He has been building something for weeks now, tracing every discrepancy he can find between the file your father's people produced and the Foundation's actual records. If you want to help, that is where the help is needed, not in apologies, in evidence. And I want to be honest with you, Roscoe. I am not walking back into this apartment or this marriage because you showed up with a good explanation. I am letting you help because the case needs help. And because some part of me still wants to believe the man from the tow tank lab is still in there somewhere. Those are two different things. I need you to understand they are two different things." "I understand," Roscoe said, and he did, or came close enough to understanding that he did not try to argue the distinction away. She gave him Dorian's number that afternoon, and by that evening, the two men were on the phone together, Roscoe answering questions about the Foundation's internal processes that only someone who had once sat on its periphery, attending dinners and half listening to board discussions, could answer with any confidence. It was during one of those calls, 3 days later, that Dorian found the piece that would finally close the case. "The account number on the earliest disbursement form," Dorian said, his voice carrying the particular calm of a person who has found something significant and is working hard not to sound too excited before confirming it fully. "The one they claim received Foundation funds in October. I pulled the Chesapeake Credit Union's public loan filing more carefully this time, cross-referenced against the county's UCC records for any liens tied to that same account number." "And," Bettina said, leaning forward, Roscoe beside her at the small kitchen table in her mother's house, the same table where she had first read the protective order months earlier. "The account was open to finance a used vehicle loan," Dorian said. "Origination date, clearly stamped and filed with the county, falls exactly 14 days after the date on the disbursement form, claiming the account received Foundation money. The account did not exist yet on the date they say I used it to receive funds. It is not possible for money to have moved through an account that had not yet been opened." Roscoe sat forward, something sharpening in his expression that Bettina recognized from the tow tank lab, the particular focus he brought to a problem once he trusted the numbers in front of him. "I have something that might help confirm the rest of it," he said. "I served on the Foundation's finance subcommittee for 1 term years ago, before Bettina and I were even married. I kept a personal copy of that year's disbursement ledger, the real one, filed the way the Foundation actually filed things internally before any of this happened. I never thought I would need it for anything. It is still in a box in my apartment." He drove to Berkeley the next morning with the ledger, a worn 3-ring binder that had sat untouched in a closet for years, and spread its pages across the kitchen table beside the printouts Dorian had emailed the night before. The numbers matched, disbursement for disbursement, exactly the figures Bettina remembered approving at board meetings, exactly the real accounts and real recipients the Foundation's federal filings confirmed. "This is it," Dorian said when Bettina called to describe what they had found. "This is the piece that turns a discrepancy into a pattern a court cannot easily explain away. You have the Foundation's own internal ledger, kept independently by a board member with no reason to falsify it, matching the federal filings exactly. And you have a fabricated file that claims something different, built around an account that provably did not exist on the date it was supposedly used. That is not an accounting error. That is a manufactured case, and now we can show it." Bettina brought everything to Renata Stedman 2 days later, spreading the ledger, the federal filings, and Dorian's timeline analysis across the small conference table in the public defender's cramped downtown office. Renata read through it slowly, methodically, the tired lines around her eyes easing slightly with each page. "This is good," Renata said finally, looking up. "This is very good, Bettina. This is the kind of documentation that does not just create reasonable doubt, it affirmatively demonstrates the account in question could not have functioned the way the prosecution's evidence claims it did. I want to file this with the court immediately, well ahead of trial, so there is no argument later that we sprang it on anyone unfairly." "What happens now?" Bettina asked. "Now we make sure this reaches the record clearly, formally, and completely," Renata said. "And we let the paperwork do what paperwork like this is supposed to do, which is tell the truth loudly enough that it cannot be talked over." Roscoe walked Bettina out of the public defender's office that afternoon, both of them quiet on the sidewalk outside, the late spring air carrying the particular warmth that meant summer was close in Norfolk, close enough to feel in the humidity even before the calendar caught up to it. "I know I do not get to simply be forgiven because I finally showed up with a binder," Roscoe said. "I understand that." "No," Bettina agreed. "You do not, but you showed up with the binder, and you showed up with the truth, and those are not nothing, Roscoe. They are not everything either, but they are not nothing." She was quiet for a moment, watching a container ship move slow and distant along the Elizabeth River at the end of the street. "Even when this ends the way we think it will, it does not put back what it cost. The tug operator is not coming back to my firm. I do not think the foundation board seat is coming back either. Whatever gets said publicly about my name being cleared, people remember the accusation longer than they remember the dismissal. That is just true, and I do not think there is a piece of paper Dorian can find that fixes it." "I know," Roscoe said, and he did not try to argue her out of it, which she appreciated more than any reassurance he could have offered instead. "I cannot give you those months back, or that client, or the board seat. I do not think I get to promise you it evens out. I can only promise I will keep showing up the way I showed up with the binder, for as long as it takes you to decide whether that is worth anything." She did not answer that with a promise of her own. She was not ready to make one yet, and she had learned this past year not to say things she did not yet know were true. But she let him walk beside her the rest of the way to the bus stop on St. Paul's Boulevard, and did not tell him to leave, and understood that for now, on this particular afternoon, that was as much of an answer as either of them had earned. Chapter 10. Corliss Street. The Circuit Court for the City of Norfolk sits on St. Paul's Boulevard, a building Bettina had walked past 100 times before she ever had reason to walk inside it as a defendant. On the morning of trial, in early June, she walked in for what she hoped would be the last time in that particular role. Renata Stedman had filed the full evidentiary package 2 weeks earlier, exactly as she had promised. The county's UCC filing showing the loan origination date, the foundation's real federal filings, and Roscoe's independently kept ledger, all laid out in a formal motion that left little room for ambiguity about what it showed. Judge Miriam Voss opened the morning's proceedings with the same brisk efficiency she had shown at the preliminary hearing months earlier, but something in her manner had changed, a stiffness that had not been there before, the posture of a person who had read something overnight she had not expected to read. Renata stood first and walked the court through the discrepancy with the plain, unhurried clarity of someone who has built an argument so solid she no longer needs to raise her voice to make it land. The account identified in the prosecution's disbursement forms as receiving foundation funds in October, Renata said, did not exist until 14 days after that date, per the county's own recorded loan filing. This is not a matter of interpretation, Your Honor. It is a matter of arithmetic. Money cannot move through an account that has not yet been opened. She placed Roscoe's ledger beside the federal filings, page by page, letting the court see for itself how closely the real records aligned and how completely the prosecution's version diverged from them. Foster Bramlett, the young assistant Commonwealth's attorney, sat very still at his table as the pages were laid out, his earlier confidence visibly draining from his posture. He had not, it was becoming clear even to him, understood the full weight of the file he had been handed months earlier, had trusted its assembly the way a person trusts a bridge they did not personally inspect. It was during the recess that followed, called by Judge Voss herself, with an abruptness that surprised the room, that the final piece of the matter resolved itself outside the courtroom rather than inside it. Renata's motion, filed alongside the evidentiary package, had included a formal request that the court examine its own scheduling history in the case, the denied continuance, the unusually rapid preliminary hearing, the acceptance of forged records without meaningful scrutiny. It was a careful, precisely worded request, not an accusation, but an invitation for the court to look honestly at its own docket. Renata had also quietly and separately forwarded a copy of the full evidentiary package to the Virginia State Bar and to the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office, flagging Griffin Doyle by name as the apparent author of the falsified disbursement forms and requesting that his conduct, and the conduct of anyone who directed it, be reviewed independently of the case against Bettina. When the hearing resumed, Judge Voss did not return to the specific findings Renata had asked for. She addressed the room from the bench with a formality that had gone entirely without its earlier brusqueness. In light of the evidence submitted this morning, and out of an abundance of caution regarding the appearance of impartiality in this matter, the court is recusing itself from further proceedings, Voss said. This case will be reassigned to another judge for any further action deemed necessary by the Commonwealth. Foster Bramlett stood a moment later, and in a voice that had lost whatever certainty it once carried, informed the court that given the evidentiary record now before it, the Commonwealth was moving to dismiss the charges against Bettina Loach. The motion was granted without argument. No jury had ever been seated. There was no verdict, no dramatic reading of a not guilty finding to a hushed room, only the quiet, procedural sound of a case ending the way most cases actually end, on paper, in a few sentences spoken plainly by people doing their jobs. Bettina sat very still for a moment after Renata told her, in a low voice, that it was over, that she could stand up now and walk out of the courtroom as a free woman with no charges attached to her name. It did not feel in that moment like the ending she had imagined during the long months in her mother's kitchen. It felt smaller than that, and quieter, and somehow more real for being so. She found, once she stood, that her hands would not stop shaking, the same tremor that had taken hold of her in the parking lot on Granby Street the morning the process server first found her, arriving now in reverse, relief moving through her body with the same physical force the fear once had. Holt Brannigan was sitting 3 rows back in the gallery. He had come, Bettina understood later, because Griffin had assured him the recusal request would be denied, that Judge Voss would hold, that the case would proceed to trial exactly as planned. He had not expected to watch it collapse in a single recess, and he had not expected to still be sitting there, visibly and publicly caught out, when Bettina turned from the defense table and saw him. She walked toward him before Renata could stop her, and she did not raise her voice, because she had spent a year learning that the loudest thing in a room is not always the truest, and she wanted, more than anything, for this to be true. "You had every resource in the world," Bettina said, standing close enough that only he could hear her clearly. "A law firm, a foundation, a judge who has known your family for decades, and you still could not build a case that survived one honest accountant with a library card and a filing cabinet. That is what you spent a year of my life on, Mr. Brannigan, a lie that could not outlast a 14-day gap in a loan filing." Holt did not answer immediately. Something moved across his face that Bettina had never once seen there in 2 years of dinners and careful measuring. Something closer to a man watching a structure he had trusted his whole life give way beneath him. "I did what I believed was necessary," he said finally, quieter than she had ever heard him. "I know," Bettina said. "That is the part that should frighten you. You believed it. You built a fake case, forged my signature, cost me my clients and my seat on your own foundation's board, and you believed the whole time you were protecting something. Your attorney is being reported to the state bar this week. The Commonwealth's attorney has the same file. Whatever happens to me ends today, Mr. Brannigan. What happens to you and Mr. Doyle is only just beginning, and this time it will not be your family's lawyer building the file." She did not wait for him to respond. She turned and walked back toward Renata, and Holt Brannigan remained seated in the gallery, alone, in a courtroom that had just finished proving, in front of witnesses, exactly how little his certainty had ever been worth. Outside, on Corliss Street, the June morning had turned warm and bright, the kind of Norfolk day that made the whole city smell faintly of the harbour. Roscoe was waiting near the courthouse steps, having been barred from the courtroom itself, as a listed witness in the case, pacing the sidewalk in a way that stopped the moment he saw her come through the doors. He did not rush toward her. He waited, letting her set the pace of the distance between them, and when she finally reached him, he did not reach for her the way he might have a year earlier, easily, assuming welcome. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, and said the thing he had been rehearsing for weeks. "I let a folder of paper make me doubt you," he said. "I let people I trusted my whole life convince me of something about you that was never true, and I did not fight hard enough, fast enough to find my way back to what I actually knew about you before any of this started. I am not going to do that again, not with anything, not ever." Bettina looked at him for a long moment. The courthouse behind her, the case number that had defined her spring, finally closed, and felt something in her chest that was lighter than she expected. Something close to the specific relief of a person who has just watched the person who hurt her sit alone in a room and understand, fully and publicly, what he had done. "I just told your father what is coming for him," she said. "The bar complaint. The Commonwealth's attorney. He sat there and watched me say it, and he did not have a single word ready for me. I have waited a year to see that." "Good," Roscoe said, and he meant it entirely, without a trace of the old instinct to soften his father's failures for her benefit. He earned every part of that. She reached out then and took his hand, the same gesture she had made across a folding table on their wedding day. The same gesture she had made in a parked car outside their apartment on a cold November night. And this time it carried the weight of a woman who had not only survived what his family built against her, but had stood in the room and made sure the man who built it knew exactly what it had cost him. They walked down Corliss Street together, past the harbour smell and the morning traffic, and for the first time since the folder had first landed on their kitchen table, the silence between them held something closer to peace than grief. There would be more to rebuild than one conversation could carry, and both of them knew it. But the case was closed. The truth was finally on the record where anyone could read it, and Holt Brannigan was left behind them in a courthouse gallery, alone with exactly what he had earned.